Thank you very much. Before we proceed, let's have roll call. We have a quorum.
Weber.
Here.
Melendez. Here. Allen. Bigelow. Bloom.
Here.
Bonta.
Here.
Campos. Chavez. Chu.
Here.
Cooper.
Here.
Gordon. Grove. Jones. Jones Sawyer. Kim.
Here.
Lackey.
Here.
McCarty.
Here.
Mullen.
Present.
Nazarian.
Present.
Obernolte.
Here.
O'Donnell.
Here.
Patterson.
Here.
Rodriguez.
Here.
Thurmond.
Here.
Ting. Wilk.
Present.
Williams.
Here.
A quorum is present.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from Mr. Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, members. As the Chair noted, these are very good times. The California economy has been performing very well, driven in large part by the Bay Area. Revenues have been doing extremely well. As Ms. Bosler noted, the department has come up in their revenue estimates. At this time, their estimates for the current year, the 15-16 fiscal year, and the budget year, 16-17, are almost exactly the same as our estimates from our November fiscal outlook. So at least at this time, we don't have the rather significant differences in revenues that we've had in the past 2 or 3 years. And we think the administration's numbers serve as a really good starting point for your budget deliberations. We published our overview of the budget as we do each year. I hope you have a copy in your packet. I just want to refer to a couple of charts in there. In fact, if you can turn to page 8, there's a chart at the bottom that basically shows how the governor allocated the discretionary monies in the budget. And what I mean by that is after that you allocate your constitutionally required spending on Prop 98, on the Proposition 2 reserves, debt spending, caseload, sort of normal things. What did you have left over to make policy choices with? And as you see on the pie chart that we have at that bottom of the page, the governor spent a very large amount on adding to the reserves, that is, in addition to what is required to be put into the reserve under Proposition 2. He spent a large amount on infrastructure, as Ms. Bosler noted, both for state buildings, for deferred maintenance, local jails. And then there is another significant part for some ongoing spending, with one reserved, and then we've noted on the chart that you'll see, the MCO tax proceeds. The administration assumes that you will have the MCO tax, and it will raise a certain amount of money. The budget commits about $250 million for the IHSS program. The remainder of the net proceeds are uncommitted. That is, they have not allocated at this time. But we wanted to make sure that you were aware that's potentially, under the governor's plan, available to be spent in or to be allocated to additional reserves, however you wanted to dedicate those funds. Now, obviously, these are the governor's choices. You will make different choices in how you allocate them. But I think the chart points to some of the key budget decisions, high-level budget decisions that you need to make. And I'd like to just quickly run through those. I think number one for me is what level of reserves do you want in your budget? How much reserves, and I'm not talking just about the BSA, the Budget Stabilization Account that was reconstituted by Proposition 2. You also have your historical reserves. It's the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties. Think of that as just your free surplus. Both of those are reserves available for you if you should experience a downturn. The governor's budget has about just over $10 billion in total reserves, or just under 9% of revenues. Is that a level that you feel comfortable with? Is that where you want to be by the end of 16-17? Where do you want to be at the end of 17-18? There is no right number here. In part, it will depend on your own sort of preferences and outlooks. Do you think the economy in California will continue to perform for a longer period of time? In that case, you wouldn't probably have as high a reserve level as someone who's more pessimistic about the state of the national and state economy. What's your risk aversion? If you have a real concern about dealing with a sudden downturn, you're going to want a higher reserve than someone who doesn't have that sort of level of risk. So I can't tell you what the appropriate level of risk is. What we have said is we think you should try to set a rather robust target. That is as high as you can. But you need to pick it and have a plan for getting there. And we would urge you to get there as soon as possible because you never know when the downturn can come. just looking at financial markets over the last 2.5 weeks can suggest to you how quickly things can change. And remembering that of our revenues, our general fund revenues, 2/3 come from the personal income tax, and a good chunk come from capital gains. A major source, not the only source, but a major source of the revenue volatility that you face. So we think the reserve levels that you want is one of your high-level decisions that you need to make. Now, after you make that, then you have revenues remaining that you can make new commitments against, whether it's spending commitments, additional revenue tax breaks, or EITC expansions, whatever you want to do with those. But I think your next decision is, even if you decide we have this sort of much money that we can make commitments, how much do you want to be one time and how much are you willing to be ongoing? And the crucial decision there is that clearly, again, if you're more risk averse, if you're more concerned about the near-term future, whatever commitments you did make, you would make a higher proportion of them as one time. Because they go away, if you experience a downturn next year, you're not having to make adjustments to ongoing spending. So you need to balance that and figure out what is the relative mix. You see how the governor made his decisions. Think about how you want to make those decisions. One thing I'm sorry I didn't mention on the reserve level. Even if you pick your reserve level, let's say that you want to be at 10% by the end of next budget year. I would urge you to take into account both the reserves, not just the BSA. And as Ms. Bosler noted, the governor is proposing to add $2 billion more into the BSA. Well, for us, I don't think it's as important as where you put it. In fact, there are some limitations on your flexibility if you decide to go along with the administration and put the money in the BSA. Because once you do that, you've lost control of it. It's expenditures out of the BSA are governed by constitutional rules. Whereas if you set aside the money in your free surplus, you still have control over that. So there's clearly pluses and minuses to both approaches. I think you won't want to make those decisions until you get to May, but it is something to think about on the mix between your two reserves also. Finally, on your not finally, I have a couple more points, but on your one time, the governor has focused on infrastructure. And we commend the administration because we think that infrastructure is one of the most important things you do. You have lots of demands in bringing your infrastructure just up to date, your existing infrastructure up to date. But it's not the only one-time expenditure. You have lots of other things that you could think about spending on whatever proportion of your resources you think you can spend on one-time spending. You have lots of retiree liabilities, as Ms. Bosler noted. Those have a very high cost, annual cost to them, about 7.5%. You may want to do more things on retiring some of those liabilities. So you do have choices in addition to what the governor has selected. You do get down to then also, you have one-time spending, you have a certain amount of ongoing spending that you can make commitments to. And I would just point out that one key decision in front of you that could influence how much money you feel comfortable committing to ongoing programs is the MCO tax. The governor, I think, has in his A pages suggested that he might be open to additional spending on such things as Department of Developmental Services. But the point is, if you do pass the MCO tax, you have a source of revenue there that is basically from the federal government. You're leveraging lots of federal funds. And it's in some sense, it's a much more stable source of funding than your own revenue structure that's subject to capital gains fluctuations and other business types of income fluctuations. So that will be an important part, I think, in your overall budget sort of architecture. With that, let me just quickly comment on a couple of program areas. First, Proposition 98. Once again, schools do extremely well in this budget. The governor proposes to spend most of the money in K-12 on the local control funding formula, which is something that you as a legislature have, I think, supported in the past, in recent years. There's a lot of one-time monies in the Proposition 98 budget. Whenever you increase a past year's guarantee, the school year is essentially over, so you think about those as one-time resources. The administration proposes, again, to use those primarily to retire mandate debts. We think that's generally a good idea. I think we hope to come up with some ideas on how we might retire those debts a little bit faster. We have significantly higher property tax estimates than the administration, about $1 billion over the 2 years. If we get to May and those numbers are looking like they're more solid, that would obviously give you more resources to deal with. So we'll be looking at that and obviously advising you as we get more information. And then the administration has some very important proposals in restructuring both preschool and child care. And while there's still a lot of details that you don't know about, we think generally the administration approach makes a lot of sense. It takes what are currently duplicative, complex ways of providing different types of preschool programs and child care programs, and it tries to simplify those, or I think the intent is to simplify them and to focus funds on the lowest income children. So while there's still a lot you need to learn, we need to learn, and we hope to help you in fleshing out those proposals and perhaps offering you with alternatives to them. We think the approach of the administration has a lot of merit. And then finally, just a few comments about infrastructure again, because it is such an important area for the state. The governor has proposed $1.5 billion for state facilities. Clearly, you can make a reasonable case for any of those buildings that they have proposed. But just remember, you have lots of infrastructure needs. So, in effect, it makes it harder for you to try to take into account the infrastructure needs across the spectrum as opposed to just looking at state office buildings. But you may have much higher projects that you feel should be funding before you fund the specific 3 state buildings. You may have even higher priority state buildings that you think should be funded, even if you agree that a large proportion of those funds should go to state facilities. So you have difficult decisions there because they're very hard to weigh different infrastructure proposals in different areas: transportation, resources, school facilities, state facilities. So we don't envy you. We'll do our best to help you out in that regard. But you do have a lot more choices than what is in front of you in the governor's budget. You also need to have a lot more information, I think, from the administration. They did provide an assessment, for example, of the state buildings that the DGS provided that lists what they think of the order that we should be addressing them. They didn't give you a sequencing plan, which for Sacramento is really important on how you take care of buildings. So I think that's the type of information you're going to need. And you're going to want to maintain oversight of the infrastructure proposals. The administration is proposing that this $1.5 billion that would be put into a facilities fund be continuously appropriated, meaning as soon as you put the money in, you would in fact lose control over that. We would strongly recommend that you not do that. Maintain control over these monies. These are huge projects, important projects. You don't want to defer too much authority to the administration. With that, Madam Chair, I'll close. Happy to answer any question, and my staff, as always, we look forward to helping you in whatever ways we can in devising a 16-17 budget.
Thank you very much. You both have been very helpful and very informative. We'll take questions from our members at this time. Just want to ask one or two, how much progress are we making on our key liabilities at this point in terms of addressing those issues?
We still have approximately $224 billion in debts and liabilities, including our pension, our PERS and STIRS, and also the UC pensions and health, as well as the retiree health liability. But we've made a significant progress. Last year, we completely paid off the K-14 deferrals, which was something that had plagued the state for nearly a decade. We also have made significant progress in paying down our special fund loans, and all of that is very important to keeping programs running, and also good for building more capacity. We also last year, as part of the budget, took a major step to pay down liabilities related to the STIRS fund. So that there are some major things that the state has accomplished over the last several years to pay down those debts and liabilities.
So we're at $224 billion? We
are, and I wish I had it at my fingertips.
Do you know approximately what percentage is that we've paid down thus far?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that, Matthew.
I think those are the outstanding liabilities,
okay,
Madam Chair. But I think
those are the that's the outstanding. Sorry, and that's not what I don't have at my fingertips is the amount we've paid down, and I'd be happy to get that back for you.
Okay, that would be helpful, and I assume we have a plan to do that, in the governor's thinking.
Well, the major plan is using the Proposition 2 debt repayment requirements over the next 10 years approximately. We'll be dedicating monies every year to paying down debts and liabilities. The other major strategy we have in this budget is bargaining with our employee units, the sharing the pre-funding of the retiree health benefit, and that will do a lot to reduce future liabilities as we go forward. So those are the two major strategies we have for continuing to pay down the state's liabilities.
Okay. Do we have, at this time, we're going to hear from Ms. Melendez. Do you have any questions? Mm-hmm.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have two questions, one relating to corrections and one relating to transportation. So regarding corrections, the LAO estimated when we were contemplating proposition and its passage that it would, the estimated cost savings would be in the high tens of millions to possibly 100 million. And I think the advocates with whom I spoke personally were estimating that it would be even higher. But 2 weeks ago, there was a report that said this year it's only projected to be 29.3 million. So I'm wondering if you can provide any explanation or detail on why that estimate fell so far below what was originally contemplated.
Yes, the Proposition 40 estimate was the analysis that for the first time that the Department of Finance did for this budget. And we do assume that the Proposition 47 will reduce the state's prison population by approximately 4,700 inmates. But it's important to note, how that initiative impacted the prison population and everything else that was going on in the prisons at the same time, and were started before Proposition 47 passed. And as you all are well aware, the state has been working towards compliance with the 3-judge panel to reduce prison overcrowding for many years now. And through that court interaction and directives, court orders, the administration had put in place several other prison reduction efforts that had gone into effect before Proposition 47 had passed. And so while Proposition 47 is absolutely accelerating the pace at which offenders are moved to the community, there was maybe less of an impact as some may have expected. It's also important to note that in these early years, there are additional offsetting costs to those savings. Mainly the costs are in our trial courts where they are having additional hearing workload as more people are resentenced under the new rules of Proposition 47. We do expect that the savings will grow over the next several years, and as some of those costs do go down, and our long-term projections are of approximately 57 million.
57 million savings over what period of time?
By 17-18. By 2017-18. So that would be annual savings.
So that would
savings.
be...
yeah.
So originally you estimated it would be about 100 million, and now it's 57?
We had never estimated 100 million. I think the proponents of the initiative, others had estimated that. Our estimates were first came out this budget, and they are 57 million.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question relating to transportation. Okay, so we have budget projects that, well, there is suggestion that we generate an additional $500 million a year by raising the gas taxes. So I want you to comment on the fact that we have a system in which we are encouraging people either through financial motivation or otherwise to drive less. or drive vehicles that don't require fuel or nearly not as much fuel. Yet we are relying very heavily on a gas tax, which is supposed to fund our transportation needs. So you're going to have to explain to me how that works, because if you're wanting people to drive less, if you're wanting, not you personally, if the administration and we as a society want people to drive less and use less fuel, yet rely very heavily on the consumption of those products, then how is it that we are going to fund the transportation needs that we say that we need?
Yes. So currently, the state's very dependent on fuel taxes to fund its transportation system. This proposal includes a road user charge, which is going forward would be a much more stable source of revenue for our core maintenance of our state highway system and our local roads. The gas tax component is actually, I would characterize as stabilizing the rate. Right now, the rate is adjusted by the Board of Equalization annually, and that creates even more volatility for the consumer. So our proposal is to fix the tax and then adjust it for inflation going forward in an effort to stabilize the gasoline tax. It also contains an 11-cent diesel tax that we think is closely tied to making important investments in our trade corridors for those trucks that are highly dependent on those roads and our economy.
Are you suggesting indexing the gas tax?
Yes, that's always been part of our proposal.
Okay,
Yeah.
just want to make sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair, staff. Thank you both very much for the presentation. I represent San Mateo County, lowest unemployment rate in the state, job generator, revenue generator for the state budget, but we have an acute affordable housing crisis. I hear about it every day. It's a major issue. My question is around, centers on the $1 billion discrepancy on local property tax revenues that is cited in the LAO report. I'm curious about the sources of data that both DOF uses and LAO uses to come up with that figure. There's about a $700 million figure related to the dissolution of redevelopment agencies, another $300 million and change. In other areas, there are discrepancies on assessments and so forth. So I'm just trying to understand how you can have a $1 billion difference. And if I could just make up, since we're talking about policy choices with some of the funds, the discretionary use, that $1 billion, if it materializes, could be a source of funds for affordable housing, given that there's a nexus there if we want to talk about policy choices. But the question is around the sources of data and how real that $1 billion might be with regard to property tax.
Chris Hill for Department of Finance. Our redevelopment estimates are based on actual defeasements of redevelopment debt as they occur, and we also use a regression analysis model to model out the property taxes. So when we're looking at the amount of revenue expected to be received from RDA dissolution, we're looking at the actual defeasements of the debts as they occur as we authorize the payments to be made. So we're working off actual numbers. And we also backed out a lot of one-time revenue, one-time settlement payments, and one-time remittances of unencumbered funds that I'm not sure the LAO may have totally accounted for in their estimates.
Just to follow up, there's two components of the difference between the LAO and our office on the property tax. One is the redevelopment component, and the Department of Finance is the main state agency that is overseeing the dissolution of redevelopment. And so those numbers we have are actuals. So that difference, I think we feel fairly comfortable with our numbers, but we're in constant conversation with the LAO on that. The other component is just the actual growth in property tax, and that's an area where we're slightly below the LAO, and we will continue to talk with the LAO, and we're going to be redoing our model for the May revision. So we will continue to monitor how the strength of the property tax collections.
Jason Sisney from the LAO. The difference is over a 2-year period. And so viewed at in that respect, the percentage difference actually is not all that great between our office and finance. So we'll continue to look at the data and think about it more through May. It's possible it'll end up closer to our number, theirs, or somewhere in between. But I think that viewed off of the entire property tax base that's available to schools, it's actually not that large a percentage difference. And it is the sort of difference between estimates that you might see in any given year.
Okay, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for the Department of Finance. First question concerns unemployment insurance. And as you know, several years ago during the recession, the state of California took out loans from the federal government to shore up our unemployment insurance fund, and then subsequently defaulted on the repayment of those loans. And so currently all of our employers in the state of California pay a penalty every year to the federal government as a result of the state's lack of action to pay those back. And I think probably everyone on this dais has heard about this issue this month because it's a penalty that creeps up on employers. First of all, it's a progressive penalty, so it gets bigger every year. Second of all, it's not a penalty that is collected over the year. It's paid all at once during the month of January. So businesses in my district, for example, are just starting to notice this. In past years, it's only been a few dollars since they've just written the check. This year, it is substantial. In fact, for a typical small business, it might be $8,000 or $10,000. There's a plumbing contractor in one of my cities had an $8,000 bill. A defense contractor in another of my cities had to defer purchase of some equipment because they had this unexpected expense. So you've stated that the administration's priorities are paying down debts and liabilities, which I think is very laudable, but the current proposal has no plan to repay this particular debt, and I wondered if you could explain why.
I would be happy to have my colleague, Kristen Shelton, who is much more expert than I in the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, and I'll have her explain the situation. It is something that this administration has tried to tackle in the past. It's a very difficult conversation with employers and employee groups. And it is something we have tried to tackle in the past. We don't have a current proposal in front of you in this budget, but it is something we continue to monitor. And as the economy has strengthened, the debt has continued to go down. Unfortunately, because we have that debt, the employer penalty does kick in, and it will continue to go up as long as we have that debt on the books. But I'll give Kristen a chance to give you a little more details.
Sure. Kristen Shelton, Department of Finance. I think Keeley framed the issue well in that the existing structure that the federal government has outlined does have a methodology in place to begin to pay down that debt in the absence of action on the part of the state. We have had a number of attempts at trying to bring both the employers and the business groups together to try to find a broader resolution. But at this point, we're expecting the fund to be fully solvent and the loan to be fully repaid in 2018. It is partly a function of those employers paying more, and we recognize that part of the federal unemployment tax adjustment credit that employers typically receive has dropped. So it's a greater cost of $24 per employee per year, and that the lack of a solvency solution right now is costing employers about $126 per employee. So we continue to be open to conversations in this area, but it does take agreement on both parts of the employers and labor groups to be able to make the statutory changes to adjust maybe the taxable wage base, which is currently at the federal minimum of $7,000 per employee.